It's done.
Goodbye, Nathan.
The pen scratched against paper before the man holding it even glanced down. Nathan Washington signed the divorce papers the way he signed discharge orders, quickly, mechanically, without ceremony. His attention remained fixed on the tablet, where a trauma patient's vitals pulsed in urgent red, each beep a call he couldn't ignore. Across from him sat Elizabeth Moses, spine straight but hands trembling in her lap, exhaustion carved into the shadows beneath her eyes. She watched him, waiting just once for him to lift his gaze, to acknowledge that what they were ending had once been everything. He never did. The pen clattered onto the desk. The marriage was over. Nathan stood, adjusted his stethoscope like armor returning to position, and offered the only words that came, "Take care of yourself, Elizabeth." Her smile was a wound trying to close. "You too, Dr. Washington." The door clicked shut behind her, a sound that would echo through 6 years of silence. Outside, Elizabeth pressed her back against the hospital's brick wall, her breathing shallow as she clutched her purse to her chest. Inside the bag, buried beneath her wallet and keys, lay a drugstore pregnancy test. 2 pink lines, a future he'd never stopped to notice. He didn't even look up. That told her everything she needed to know. That night, Elizabeth loaded her car with everything that mattered: clothes, books, a framed photo she'd later turn face down, and drove away from the life they'd built. She carried with her a secret that would grow in the dark, a piece of him he'd been too distracted to see, a heartbeat he'd never know he'd created. What Elizabeth didn't know, as city lights disappeared in her rearview mirror, was that 6 years later, that hidden heartbeat would become the only thing standing between Nathan Washington and death. But that night, driving through darkness toward an uncertain future, all she knew was this: she was alone, pregnant, and finally free. Charleston welcomed her with salt air and slower rhythms. She found a tiny apartment above a flower shop on a cobblestone street where tourists wandered and church bells marked the passing hours. The rent was cheap because the stairs were steep and the hot water unpredictable, but the windows faced east, and morning light poured in like a promise. She took work where she could find it, designing greeting cards for a local print shop, her illustrations of magnolias and crescent moons appearing in gift stores she'd never visit. The pay was modest, barely enough, but her hands were busy and her mind was quiet. That was worth more than any salary Nathan had ever earned. Her pregnancy she wore like a secret treasure, hidden beneath oversized sweaters and flowing dresses. Strangers smiled at her in the grocery store, never knowing. She preferred it that way. This life growing inside her belonged to no one but herself. When Amara arrived on a rainy April morning, tiny fists clenched and eyes wide open, Elizabeth wept, not from the pain of labor, but from the overwhelming peace of holding something pure, something unmarked by disappointment. "You're mine," she whispered into soft, dark curls. "Just mine." The years that followed were lean but lovely. Their apartment became a kingdom of 2, breakfast for dinner when money was tight, bedtime stories told by candlelight when the power bill waited, Sunday morning pancakes shaped like hearts, because joy didn't require wealth. Amara grew bright and curious, her laughter echoing off the cramped walls like music. And every time Elizabeth looked into her daughter's deep brown eyes, Nathan's eyes, undeniably his, she would stroke her cheek and whisper the same promise: "You'll never have to beg to be seen." Poverty stalked them, yes, but so did freedom, and Elizabeth had learned which one cost more. On Amara's 6th birthday, Elizabeth brought cupcakes to the flower shop downstairs as thanks for the owner's kindness. The small television behind the counter was playing the evening news. Then she heard the name. Dr. Nathan Washington, Chief of Trauma Surgery, has been named Hospital of the Year's Physician of Excellence. Elizabeth's breath caught. On the screen, Nathan stood in a tailored suit, accepting an award, his smile professional and hollow. Older now, more distinguished, still alone, her eyes filled with something she couldn't name, pride and pain braiding together like storm clouds gathering. He'd saved countless lives, built an empire of achievement, become everything he'd worked for. And he had no idea that his greatest legacy was upstairs right now, frosting still on her lips, drawing pictures of flowers she'd never have to compete with a pager to show him. Should a man who gave everything to strangers but nothing to love ever get a second chance? Drop your thoughts below, because fate was about to ask Elizabeth that very question. While Elizabeth was teaching Amara to draw flowers in Charleston, Nathan Washington was building monuments to his loneliness. 6 years had transformed him into exactly what he'd always wanted to be: indispensable. Chief of Trauma Surgery. Hospital of the Years, Physician of Excellence. A medical floor bearing his name in bronze lettering. Every wall in his office displayed another award, another accolade, another proof that he mattered. But no one was waiting when he came home. His penthouse apartment gleamed with expensive emptiness, marble countertops that had never seen a family dinner, a king bed he slept in alone, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that sparkled with other people's lives. He'd built a fortress of glass and silence, and called it success. The guilt lived in the quiet moments. Late nights, he'd drive through empty city streets, rain streaking his windshield, headlights carving temporary paths through darkness. Sometimes he'd take the long way home, past the neighborhood where he and Elizabeth had once lived. The house had new owners now, different curtains in the windows, a child's bike on the porch. He'd slow down, just for a moment, and remember Elizabeth laughing in the kitchen, flower on her cheek, her perfume lingering in the hallway when he'd come home late. The way she'd wait up for him, hope fading with each passing hour, until eventually she stopped waiting at all. Then he'd blink, and the memories would scatter like smoke. At the hospital, colleagues joked about his devotion. Married to the job, they'd say, nudging him at staff meetings. "When are you going to find yourself a real wife, Washington?" He'd smirk, never laugh. "Medicine's a jealous mistress. One's enough." They thought he was joking. He wasn't. Every life he saved reminded him of the one he'd lost. Every patient he stayed late for was penance for the woman he'd ignored. Every chart he obsessed over was another brick in the wall between himself and the man he used to be. When a new resident asked him once if he'd ever remarry, Nathan had answered without looking up from his paperwork, "Medicine's enough for me." But that night, standing alone in the hospital's third-floor bathroom, staring at his reflection in the harsh, fluorescent light, he whispered a different truth to the stranger in the mirror. "Then why do I still feel empty?" His reflection had no answer. The rain came suddenly that evening, the kind of storm that turns familiar roads into rivers. Nathan's phone buzzed as he pushed through the hospital's exit doors. Severe weather alert. Flash flooding expected. Drive safely. He glanced at the message, then slipped the phone into his pocket. He'd driven through worse. He'd survived worse. What was a little rain compared to the storms inside him? His car pulled onto the slick highway, wipers struggling against the downpour. The city lights blurred into watercolor streaks. His mind wandered back to Elizabeth, always back to Elizabeth, and he didn't notice the curve ahead sharpening, the road turning treacherous. Fate had been patient for 6 years, but tonight it was finally ready to collect. Can success ever fill the hole left by love? Or was Nathan racing toward the reckoning he'd been running from all along? Drop your thoughts below, because in the next 60 seconds, everything was about to change. While Elizabeth was teaching Amara to draw flowers in Charleston, Nathan Washington was building monuments to his loneliness. 6 years had transformed him into exactly what he'd always wanted: indispensable. Chief of Trauma Surgery, Physician of Excellence, a hospital wing bearing his name in polished bronze letters. His office walls displayed a decade of achievements, plaques, certificates, framed articles calling him the surgeon who never sleeps. He had everything except someone waiting when he came home. His penthouse apartment was a showpiece of expensive emptiness, marble countertops that never saw family dinners, a king bed he slept in alone, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city glittering with other people's lives. He'd built a fortress of glass and silence around his guilt and called it success. The loneliness lived in the quiet moments. Late nights, when the adrenaline of surgery faded, he'd drive through empty streets, headlights slicing through rain, haunted by what he'd lost. Sometimes he'd take the long route home, past the neighborhood where he and Elizabeth had lived. New curtains hung in those windows now. A child's bike leaned against the porch. He'd slow down, remembering Elizabeth laughing in their kitchen, flour dusting her cheek, her perfume lingering in the hallway when he'd stumble home at midnight, the way she'd wait up with cold dinner on the table, hope dimming in her eyes with each broken promise, until eventually she stopped waiting at all. Then he'd blink, and the memories would scatter like ghosts at dawn. At the hospital, colleagues teased him about his devotion. Married to the job, they'd joke at staff meetings. "When are you finding yourself a real wife, Washington?" He'd smirk, never laugh. "Medicine's a jealous mistress. One's enough." They thought he was joking. Every life he saved reminded him of the one he'd destroyed. Every patient he stayed late for was penance for the woman he'd ignored. Every chart he obsessed over was another brick in the wall, separating him from the man he used to be. When a young resident once asked if he'd ever remarry, Nathan answered without looking up, "Medicine's enough for me." But that night, alone in the third-floor bathroom, staring at his hollow reflection under fluorescent lights, he whispered the truth to the stranger in the mirror. "Then why do I still feel empty?" His reflection offered no answers. The rain started suddenly that Thursday evening, transforming familiar roads into rivers. Nathan's phone buzzed as he pushed through the hospital exit. Severe weather alert. Flash flooding. Drive safely. He glanced at the screen, then slipped it into his pocket. He'd driven through worse, survived worse. What was a little rain compared to the storms he carried inside? His BMW pulled onto the slick highway, wipers struggling against the deluge, city lights blurred into watercolor streaks. His mind wandered back to Elizabeth, always back to Elizabeth, and he didn't see the curve ahead sharpening, didn't feel the road turning treacherous beneath him. Fate had been patient for 6 years. Tonight, it was finally ready to collect its debt. Can a man like Nathan ever redeem himself? Or do some mistakes last forever? Drop your thoughts below, because in 60 seconds, everything he'd built was about to come crashing down. The world became rain, speed, and physics. Nathan's foot eased off the gas as the curve tightened, but the road had other plans. The car hydroplaned floating, weightless for one terrifying heartbeat, then gravity remembered its job. Metal screamed against guardrail. Glass exploded into diamonds. The steering wheel jerked from his hands as the BMW spun, headlights painting wild arcs across darkness. A flash of light, the crushing sound of impact. Then, nothing. Silence, thick and final. Sirens pulled him back, first distant, then deafening. Voices overlapped in urgent chaos. Someone was cutting through his door, the sharp scent of gasoline mixed with rain and copper-sweet blood. Nathan tried to speak, but his body wouldn't obey. Pain radiated from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then movement being lifted, rolled, strapped down. The world tilted and swayed. Ceiling tiles passed overhead in a stuttering rhythm he recognized. I'm in my own trauma unit. But this time, he wasn't wearing the white coat. He was wearing the blood. Fluorescent lights seared his vision. Machines beeped in frantic rhythm, his own heart monitor, counting down. Faces swam above him, blurred and distant. He tried to focus, tried to take command like he always did, but his voice came out as a broken whisper. I'm a doctor here. We know, Dr. Washington. We've got you. But the voice that cut through the chaos wasn't one he recognized, young, female, calm with an undertone of steel. Stay with me, sir. You're not leaving me tonight. Through the haze of shock and pain, Nathan saw her, a young nurse leaning over him, maybe mid-20s, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes fierce with determination. Her hands moved across his chest with practiced precision, starting an IV line, checking pupil response, calling out vitals he could barely process. Her name tag swam into focus. Amara Moses. Something inside him shifted, recognition without understanding, a pull he couldn't explain. Pressure's dropping, someone called from his left. He's losing too much blood, another voice added, tinged with resignation. The nurse Amara didn't flinch. Not on my shift. Her hands pressed against the wound on his abdomen, firm and unyielding. Come on, Dr. Washington. You've saved hundreds of people in this room. Now let us save you. Nathan's vision darkened at the edges. His heartbeat stuttered, skipping like a failing engine. We're losing him, someone shouted. Crash cart. Now. Amara's face hovered above him, her voice cutting through the gathering dark. Don't you dare give up. Stay with me. Stay with me. The defibrillator charged a rising hum that filled the trauma bay. Clear. Electricity surged through his chest, his body arched, time fractured, and then a beat. Weak but there. Another. Another. Nathan's eyes fluttered open, consciousness returning in painful waves. The first thing he saw was her face, Amara Moses, breathing hard, relief flooding her features, but it was her eyes that held him captive. Deep brown, flecked with amber, fierce and familiar in a way that made no sense. Eyes he'd seen before, in another lifetime, reflected in a mirror he used to share, eyes that looked exactly like his own. Recovery was slow, measured in beeping monitors and incremental improvements that felt like victories. Nathan drifted in and out of consciousness those first 48 hours, his body fighting through trauma, while his mind circled one inexplicable thought: those eyes. When he finally stabilized, moved from critical to serious, then serious to stable, one constant remained: the young nurse who'd refused to let him die. Amara Moses appeared like clockwork: morning rounds at 7, vitals check at noon, evening medication at 6. She moved through his room with quiet efficiency, adjusting IV drips, checking surgical dressings, making notes on his chart with the same careful attention he'd once given his own patients. Professional, kind, steady. But Nathan couldn't stop staring. It wasn't inappropriate, he told himself that repeatedly. It was something else, something that nagged at the edges of his medicated consciousness, like a word forgotten on the tip of his tongue. The way she tilted her head when concentrating, the precise movements of her hands, that shade of brown in her eyes, warm with flecks of amber catching the light. Familiar. On the 4th day, when she came to check his incision, he finally worked up the courage to ask, "Have we met before?" Amara glanced up from unwrapping fresh gauze, a gentle smile crossing her face. "No, sir. I'd remember treating the chief of trauma surgery." "Not professionally," Nathan pressed, his voice still weak. "I mean, before. You seem, I don't know, familiar somehow." Her laughter was light, musical, and it hit him like an echo of something he'd lost. "I promise, Dr. Washington, this is our first meeting, though I'll take it as a compliment that I made an impression." She finished dressing his wound with practiced care, then squeezed his shoulder reassuringly before leaving. Nathan lay back against the pillows, exhausted and confused. That laugh, those eyes, the nagging sensation that he was missing something obvious, something important, something that mattered. That evening, Amara sat in her car in the hospital parking garage, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The double shift had drained her, but it was more than physical exhaustion weighing her down. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. "Hey, Mom." "Baby, you sound tired." Elizabeth's voice carried immediate concern. "Long day?" "The longest." Amara sighed, watching rain streak down her windshield. "We had a really critical case earlier this week. Car accident. He almost didn't make it." "But you saved him?" "We did." A small smile. "He's actually recovering in my wing now. Dr. Nathan Washington, you know, the chief of trauma." Kind of ironic, the head surgeon becoming the patient. Silence. Not the comfortable kind that often settled between them, but something sharp and sudden. "Mom? You there?" The sound that came through the phone was barely audible, something between a gasp and a sob, cut short. "What did you say his name was?" Elizabeth's voice had changed completely, stripped of warmth, tight with something Amara couldn't identify. "Nathan Washington." "Mom, what's wrong?" On the other end of the line, Elizabeth stood frozen in her small kitchen, one hand gripping the counter for support. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering against the tile floor. 6 years of careful distance, 6 years of building a life where the past couldn't reach them, 6 years of protecting her daughter from a father who'd never wanted to be found. And now her Amara, had saved his life. Elizabeth's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window above the sink, tears streaming down her face as she whispered to the ghost of the girl she used to be. "You saved him, Amara, and you don't even know." Elizabeth hadn't set foot in a hospital since the night Amara was born. Now she stood in the lobby of Nathan's kingdom, clutching a bouquet of white lilies like armor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd told herself she was just delivering flowers, a kind gesture for the staff who'd saved a patient's life. A normal thing, an innocent thing, a lie. She moved through the corridors on autopilot, muscle memory from a life she'd left behind guiding her to the trauma wing. 3rd floor, east hallway, room 312. The door was half open. Elizabeth paused outside, steadying her breathing, then stepped into the doorway. Nathan sat propped against pillows, reading a medical journal despite doctor's orders to rest. Afternoon light streamed through the window, catching silver in his hair that hadn't been there 6 years ago. He looked older, tired, still handsome in that focused, unreachable way. Then he glanced up. Time didn't slow, it collapsed entirely. The journal slipped from his hands. Color drained from his face. His lips formed her name, but no sound came out at first, just a breathless exhale of recognition and shock. "Elizabeth." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Hello, Nathan. It's been 6 years. His voice cracked on the number. 6 years, 2 months, and 14 days, she corrected softly, setting the flowers on the window ledge. But who's counting? Silence swelled between them, heavy with everything unsaid, everything buried, everything that had led them to this moment. Nathan's eyes searched her face, desperate and confused, then drifted past her to the hallway beyond the glass door. Amara stood at the nurse's station, laughing at something a colleague said, her head tilted back, joy lighting up her features. His gaze locked there, held. Something in his expression shifted, recognition, sliding into place like tumblers in a lock clicking open. She's mine, isn't she? The whisper was barely audible. Elizabeth's tears came without warning, spilling hot down her cheeks. You didn't look up, Nathan. That day, when I needed you to see me, to really see me, you signed those papers without even looking up. So I stopped waiting. The surgeon's mask shattered. Nathan's face crumpled, pain and realization crashing through his professional composure like a dam breaking. You took 6 years from me, he choked out, anger and anguish tangling in his voice. 6 years of her life. My daughter. You had no right. You gave them away. Elizabeth's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Every late shift you chose over dinner, every anniversary you forgot, every time you looked at your pager instead of your wife. You gave us away piece by piece, and I was just the one who finally stopped pretending we could get them back. I deserved to know. You didn't deserve anything. Elizabeth's composure shattered. You want to talk about rights? You signed away your right to know the moment you chose everyone else over us. The door opened. Both of them froze. Amara stood in the doorway, confusion written across her face as her eyes moved between the crying woman and her patient. Mom, what are you doing here? What's going on? The word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Mom. Nathan's eyes went wide. Amara's gaze shifted to him, then back to Elizabeth, then to him again, pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed suddenly forcing themselves together. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but felt like hours. Amara's face changed, shock replacing confusion, then something harder. Betrayal, maybe, or the terrible weight of understanding arriving all at once. No, she whispered, taking a step backward. No, you can't be. Her voice trailed off as she stared at Nathan, really looked at him, and saw her own eyes staring back. The man she'd saved, the father she'd never known, the same person. Elizabeth reached for her daughter, but Amara flinched away, her professional composure cracking. How long were you going to let me? She couldn't finish, couldn't breathe. She turned and walked out. The sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway was the loneliest sound either parent had ever heard. 3 weeks passed in careful silence. Amara continued her shifts, professional and distant. She changed Nathan's dressings without meeting his eyes. She answered Elizabeth's calls with one-word responses. The truth sat between all three of them like broken glass, too sharp to touch, too painful to ignore. But truth has a way of demanding resolution. The day Nathan was discharged, autumn sunlight poured through the hospital's glass doors like a promise. He moved slowly, still healing, leaning slightly on the cane physical therapy had prescribed. His belongings fit in a single bag. How strange that a life could be reduced to so little. Amara appeared to help him to the curb, silent and efficient as always. Then he saw Elizabeth waiting beside her car, hands twisted together, uncertainty written across every line of her body. For a moment, Nathan considered walking past. Pride whispered that he could, anger suggested he should, but 6 years of emptiness had taught him something about what mattered. He stopped, looked up, really looked at Elizabeth's weathered hands that had built a life alone, at Amara's guarded expression that mirrored his own defense mechanisms. You saved my life, he said quietly to Amara. Twice, actually, once in that trauma bay, and once before you even knew me. Amara frowned, puzzled. I don't understand. You gave your mother a reason to keep going when I gave her every reason to give up. His voice broke. You became the person I forgot to be. Elizabeth's eyes glistened. The three of them stood there in the hospital parking lot, not quite a family, not quite strangers, something fragile and undefined, waiting to be named. I don't know how to do this, Amara whispered finally. Neither do we, Elizabeth admitted. Nathan nodded slowly. Then maybe we figure it out together, if you'll let us try. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The months that followed were awkward and tender by turns. Nathan started visiting on Sunday mornings, bringing coffee and attempting small talk that didn't always land. He taught Amara the medical tricks he'd learned over decades, their shared language of vitals and procedures, building a bridge where other words failed. He helped Elizabeth digitize her greeting card designs, his surgeon's precision translating unexpectedly well to graphic details. They didn't speak of the past, often the wound was still too fresh, but slowly, carefully, they began building something new on top of the ruins. One rainy afternoon in December, Nathan stood in the doorway of Elizabeth's apartment, holding 2 cups of coffee, water dripping from his jacket. Elizabeth looked up from her drawing table and smiled a real smile, the first one he'd seen in 7 years. "Do you think," he asked softly, "we could ever start again?" She studied him for a long moment. "Only if you promise to look up this time." Nathan set down the coffee, stepped forward, and met her eyes, held them, didn't look away. "I promise." 6 months later, laughter echoed through Elizabeth's kitchen, now their kitchen, as Amara told a story about a disaster at the hospital, her hands gesturing wildly, while Nathan and Elizabeth listened with matching expressions of delight. Outside, rain fell softly against the windows. But this time, it didn't sound like endings. It sounded like the world washing itself clean, making space for something new to grow. Sometimes, the people we fail to see become the ones who save us. Love doesn't demand perfection, only presence. And fate always gives a second chance, but never for free. What would you have done if you were Elizabeth? Would you have told him about the child, or protected your peace in silence? Comment below. Your answer might inspire our next story. If this story touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe for more stories about love, fate, and the redemption we all deserve.